The Mafia boss saw the black maid treat a wounded stranger in the hidden basement, and something in him broke. Ella Johnson was not used to being noticed. As a maid in the grand estate of Dominic Romano, the most feared Mafia boss in the city, she kept to the shadows, quietly doing her work and staying out of sight. She had learned long ago that staying invisible was the key to surviving in this world of power, danger, and wealth. But today, everything was different. Ella had been in the basement, organizing cleaning supplies, when she heard a faint noise, a soft groan, almost imperceptible. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she was imagining things, but the sound came again, followed by a shuffling noise. Without thinking, she moved toward the sound. To her shock, lying against the wall in the dimly lit corner was a man, an unfamiliar man, bruised, bloodied, and barely conscious. His clothes were torn, and his face was pale, but there was something about him that made Ella's heart race. Instinctively, she knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she tried to assess the extent of his injuries. She could feel the weight of the situation. The man in front of her could be anyone, and Dominic's estate was not the place for strangers. But she couldn't leave him there. Her mother had always taught her that kindness mattered, no matter the circumstances, and Ella had never been one to turn away from someone in need. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to steady him, and with all her strength, she helped him sit up slightly. She didn't have much experience with medical care, but she knew enough to stop the bleeding and keep him conscious until help arrived. As she worked, her mind raced. She couldn't help but feel a surge of concern for this stranger, even though she had no idea who he was. What if Dominic found out she was hiding him? What if his men discovered her breaking the rules? She could lose everything in an instant. But Ella kept her focus, trying to ignore the fear building in her chest. She was too far in now to stop. That was when the door to the basement creaked open. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, unsure of what to do. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Dominic. She could tell by the weight of the steps, the sound of the polished leather boots against the stone floor. Ella's breath caught in her throat, and her hand instinctively moved to the man's shoulder, as if trying to shield him from view. She could feel the heat of his gaze on her, but she didn't dare look up. Instead, she continued her work, pretending not to notice the figure standing just behind her. Dominic Romano, the Mafia boss who ruled everything in sight, had just entered the basement. She could feel his presence, like a heavy weight in the air, and a chill ran down her spine. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was suffocating, thick with tension, as if the world itself had stopped turning. Then, she heard him speak. "What are you doing, Ella?" His voice was low, controlled, and it sent a shiver down her spine. She looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time in what felt like forever. His eyes were dark, intense, and searching, but there was something different in them now. She couldn't place it. I found him," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Dominic's eyes flickered over the wounded man, then back to Ella. There was a pause, one that seemed to stretch on forever, before he finally spoke again. "You're breaking the rules, Ella." His tone was cold, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, something almost vulnerable behind his usual mask of indifference. Ella felt her heart race. She had seen Dominic in action many times, knew how ruthless he could be, how dangerous his presence could be. But in that moment, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. "I couldn't just leave him there," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. He needed help. Dominic didn't say anything for a moment, and for a brief, fleeting second, Ella thought he might be angry, furious even. But then, something in his expression softened, just a fraction. She couldn't tell if it was pity or something else, but she wasn't about to question it. Dominic stepped closer, his presence now overwhelming as he looked down at her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the weight of his gaze, like it was burning into her. "You're lucky he's still breathing, Ella," he said quietly, almost as if to himself. There was a long pause, and then, to her surprise, he did something unexpected. He knelt down beside her, carefully lifting the stranger's head with a gentleness that Ella had never seen from him before. Dominic's hands were steady as he inspected the man's injuries, his face focused, completely different from the intimidating Mafia boss he usually was. For the first time, Ella saw a side of him she had never imagined, someone capable of tenderness, someone who cared. In that moment, Everything in her shifted. Something in Dominic, something she couldn't fully understand, broke. She could see it in the way his hands trembled slightly as he examined the stranger. He wasn't just the ruthless mafia boss anymore. He was something else entirely. A man who had witnessed humanity in its rawest form, and maybe, just maybe, it was something he had been searching for all along. "I've never seen you like this before," Ella whispered softly, still processing the strange tenderness she had just witnessed from Dominic. His usually cold and calculated demeanor had shifted in the basement, something human flickering behind his eyes. As Dominic carefully continued to tend to the wounded man, Ella stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. She had never imagined that a moment of compassion could change the atmosphere between them, could make her feel a strange sense of warmth where there was once only fear. Dominic, the ruthless mafia boss who controlled so much of the city, was now kneeling beside a stranger, his hands gentle as he carefully applied pressure to the man's wounds. It was surreal. Ella's mind raced, her heart thudding in her chest as she watched Dominic. His usual confidence had been replaced with a quiet intensity, and for the first time, she saw him not as a boss, but as a man, just a man, struggling with something far beyond his usual world of power and control. For a moment, she felt an odd sense of connection to him, a bond that she couldn't quite explain. She had always been invisible in his world, a servant to his needs, a shadow in the grand halls of his mansion. But in this moment, she wasn't just a maid. She was a person, and Dominic, despite all his power, was not so different from her. Ella looked down at the man who had been wounded. He was still unconscious, his body limp in Dominic's care. There was something fragile about him, something that made Ella want to protect him. Her instinct kicked in, and she couldn't help herself. "What happened to him?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Dominic didn't look up at first, as though he were lost in his thoughts. His focus remained entirely on the stranger, his brow furrowed in concentration. "He's been hurt," Dominic replied in a quiet voice, his words carrying an emotion Ella wasn't used to hearing from him. "I don't know who did this to him, but I'll make sure he's taken care of." It was a promise, a quiet promise that echoed through the stillness of the basement. Ella swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had always known that Dominic was capable of great things, violence, power, control. But this was something different. She had seen him handle business deals, deal with enemies, and intimidate rivals. But in this moment, he was showing her something more, vulnerability, even if only for a fleeting second. "You don't have to do this, Dominic," Ella said, her voice breaking slightly as she stepped forward. "You don't owe him anything." Dominic finally looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Maybe I don't," he said slowly, his voice soft. "But I can't just turn my back on someone in need. Not when I have the power to help." Ella felt a rush of conflicting emotions flood her chest. She had never heard him speak like this before. His words, though simple, were laced with something deeper. He wasn't just a mafia boss anymore. He was a man who understood what it meant to care, even if he didn't know how to express it. "I never thought you'd say something like that," she muttered, almost to herself. Dominic gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes, but it was there, just enough to soften his usual hardened expression. "I don't expect you to understand," he said quietly, "but there's more to life than power. Sometimes, it's about doing what's right." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ella stood still, unsure of what to say. She had spent so many years being afraid of Dominic, seeing him as nothing more than a force to be reckoned with. But now, in this moment, she saw him differently. She saw the man. Beneath the title, the man who, despite everything, still held on to a shred of humanity. Dominic turned his attention back to the injured stranger, his brow furrowing as he worked to stem the bleeding. "I'll call for help," he said after a moment. "We'll get a medical attention. But I need you to stay with him. Keep him calm." Ella nodded quickly, still stunned by his words, by the unexpected compassion he had shown. She watched as Dominic stood up and pulled out his phone, his posture still commanding, but there was a softness in the way he moved now. "I'll take care of this," he said. "You're not alone in this." Ella swallowed the lump in her throat as she looked at him. She couldn't quite explain it, but something had shifted between them. She had always seen him as untouchable, a figure of authority who ruled over everything. But now, she saw him as a person, Someone who, despite the walls he had built around himself, was capable of kindness, of care. Dominic made the call, his voice steady as he arranged for the man to be taken to a safe place for treatment. He ended the call with a soft sigh, then turned to look at Ella. "You did the right thing," he said softly. "Thank you." Ella blinked, the sincerity in his words catching her off guard. She had never imagined she would hear those words from him, not in a million years. But there they were, and they meant more than she could express. I couldn't leave him there," Ella said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Dominic replied, his voice low. "That's what makes you different. You're not like everyone else." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Ella felt a sense of pride she had never known before. She wasn't just a maid, a servant in Dominic's mansion. She was someone who had made a difference, someone who had shown him that there was more to life than power and control. In that moment, she realized something. The man standing before her, the Mafia boss who had built an empire with blood and steel, was capable of redemption. And maybe, just maybe, he had just found it. "I was not expecting that," Ella whispered, her voice barely audible as she sat back on her heels. Dominic's words were still echoing in her mind. "You're not like everyone else." They weren't the words she had expected to hear from him, not from the man who controlled so much of the city with a cold, unforgiving hand. She had spent years, working tirelessly, staying invisible, all in the shadows of his towering presence. And yet, here she was, feeling something she could not name, something that made her chest tighten and her pulse quicken. Dominic, the Mafia boss, had just thanked her. And it wasn't just a simple thank you. It was a statement that seemed to imply something far deeper, something that changed the way she saw him. "You're not like everyone else." The words lingered in the air as Dominic stepped away, pacing the room in quiet contemplation. Ella didn't move. She couldn't. Her hands were still trembling slightly from the moment before, the adrenaline of what had happened still coursing through her. She had seen Dominic in countless situations, dealing with enemies, running his empire, making decisions that left no room for compassion. But this was something different. She had never seen him like this. She had never seen him care. It was a vulnerability she didn't know existed within him. It made her question everything she thought she knew about him. Ella didn't dare to speak, not just yet. She was still processing. She had spent so long seeing Dominic as the monster, the untouchable figure, the one who ruled with fear. But now, for the first time, she saw him as a man, someone who wasn't so different from her, someone who had his own burdens, his own demons. She swallowed the lump that had formed in her throat. "What happens now?" she finally asked, the question slipping from her lips before she had time to think. Dominic turned to look at her. His eyes, dark and intense as always, softened just slightly. It was subtle, but it was there. He paused for a moment, as if considering her question. "Now we take him upstairs," he said, his voice steady. "He'll be safe. I'll make sure of it." The way he said it left no room for doubt. Ella nodded, her breath catching in her chest. She stood up slowly, still a bit unsteady on her feet. She had done what she could, but the weight of what had just happened was still sinking in. For a moment, it felt like the world had shifted beneath her feet, and she was standing on new ground. Dominic moved to the phone on the wall, his fingers quickly dialing a number. He spoke in low tones, arranging for the stranger to be taken to a safe location, somewhere outside the reach of anyone who would wish him harm. It was clear he was not just acting out of duty. There was something personal in the way he handled it, something that had changed in him after Ella had stepped in to help the man. Ella watched him as he spoke, noticing how different he was from the ruthless Mafia boss she had always known. There was still a certain power in his presence, but now, there was something softer, something more human. When Dominic hung up the phone, he turned to her. "Thank you," he said again, his voice more genuine than she had ever heard it. "You did the right thing." Ella felt her heart skip a beat. She had never expected him to say that. Dominic Romano, the man who controlled so much with a glance, had just thanked her for doing something simple, something human. She wasn't sure how to respond. Part of her wanted to say something, to thank him for his kindness, but another part of her felt like she was still floating in the surreal moment that had just unfolded. The powerful Mafia boss, the one who had always been untouchable, was standing before her, his gaze not full of authority, but full of something else, something more vulnerable, more raw. "You're not what I thought," she said quietly, unable to hold the words back. Dominic raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching slightly at the corners, though his expression remained mostly neutral. What did you think I was? He asked, his voice curious. Ella hesitated. I don't know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought you were. I thought you didn't care about anyone. Dominic looked at her for a moment, his gaze steady. For the briefest moment, it seemed like the world had stopped, and in that moment, everything felt clear. I care about the people who matter, he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made Ella's heart race. He paused, then added, maybe I've just never let myself care enough to show it. Ella couldn't help but feel a strange warmth spreading through her chest. It was the first time she had heard him speak like this, so open, so vulnerable. It was almost as if, in that moment, he had let down the walls he had built around himself. Dominic's eyes softened as he looked at her, and for a moment, Ella felt something pass between them, something unspoken. She didn't know what it was, but it felt like the beginning of something new, something neither of them had expected. I don't know what this means, Ella, Dominic said, his voice barely above a whisper. But you've shown me something I've never seen before. You've made me realize that maybe I've been wrong about some things. Ella didn't know how to respond. She could feel the tension in the air, but it wasn't the usual fear she had always felt around him. This was different. There was something more to it, something that made her feel like they were standing on the edge of a new chapter in their lives. I didn't do it for you, she said quietly, her voice steady. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Dominic gave her a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I know, he said, his voice soft. But it's more than that. You've made me see things differently. Ella felt her heart race again, unsure of what to say or do next. Dominic's presence was overwhelming, but in a way she had never experienced before. It was as if, in this moment, they were both trying to understand something about each other, something deeper than the roles they had played in each other's lives up until now. Ella didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a chance to truly make a difference. And maybe, just maybe, Dominic had found something in her that he hadn't known he was looking for. I don't understand, Ella whispered, her mind still racing. Everything felt like it was shifting around her, like the world had tilted on its axis, and she was left standing in the middle of something she couldn't fully comprehend. Dominic's words, his actions, they had all caught her off guard. The man who had always been untouchable, the Mafia boss who ruled over everything with an iron fist, was showing her a side of him she never thought she'd see. She had always known that Dominic was a man of power, a man who demanded respect and loyalty from everyone around him. But now, as he stood there, his expression softening, his gaze not full of command but something else, something deeper, Ella realized that there was so much more to him than the persona he projected. She had never thought that she, a mere maid, would be the one to see this side of him, but here they were, alone. And for some reason, she wasn't afraid. Dominic turned to her, his eyes still locked onto hers, his usual coldness replaced by a warmth that she couldn't quite explain. He took a deep breath, running a hand through his dark hair, a habit she had noticed whenever he was processing something. I didn't expect you to be the one to show me this, he said quietly, his voice rough. I didn't expect you to be the one to make me realize what I've been missing. Ella opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. What was she supposed to say? She had spent so many years trying to remain invisible, to avoid drawing attention to herself, and now, here she was, in the middle of something that felt too big to comprehend. She had always thought of Dominic as the enemy, as someone who existed in a world so far removed from hers that there was no possibility of ever connecting. But now, with the wounded stranger upstairs and Dominic standing before her, she couldn't deny the shift in the air. You've been right about one thing, Dominic continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I've built this empire, but I've never stopped to look at the people around me, never stopped to see what's really important. Ella's heart raced as she tried to process his words. The Mafia boss, the man who had everything, was admitting that he had missed something all along. And it wasn't just about business. It was about people. It was about humanity. The realization hit her harder than she had expected. You're not the man I thought you were, she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Dominic's eyes flickered, a flash of something, regret, passing over his face. I've been trying to be, he admitted, but maybe that's not enough anymore. There was a moment of silence between them, the kind that hung in the air with a weight that was almost too much to bear. Ella looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. She saw beyond the cold exterior, beyond the Mafia boss who ruled with fear and power. She saw the man who was struggling to reconcile everything he had built with the realization that there was more to life than control. She felt something stir inside her, something that was both terrifying and comforting at the same time. She had spent so many years suppressing her feelings, hiding behind her role as a maid, that now, when faced with Dominic's vulnerability, she didn't know how to respond. But she didn't need to say anything. Dominic took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them. "Ella," he said softly, his voice low, "I don't know what comes next. I don't know where this is going, but I know that I can't go back to the way things were." Ella's breath caught in her throat. What was he saying? Was this some kind of twisted game to him, or was there something real between them? She didn't know. She couldn't be sure. But in that moment, as Dominic stood before her, she realized that things had changed. For both of them. "You don't have to go back," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "None of us do." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, it felt like everything had shifted, like the walls that had once separated them had begun to crumble. Dominic didn't say anything at first, but he nodded, as though he understood exactly what she meant. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was different now. It was filled with something new, something neither of them had expected. "Maybe we can figure this out together," Dominic said after a long pause, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt heavy with meaning, with the weight of everything that had led them to this moment. Ella didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what might come next. She wasn't afraid of Dominic. And for the first time, she felt like they were both standing on the same ground. "Maybe we can," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. And in that moment, as they stood together in the quiet of the basement, Ella realized that she had just stepped into a new world. A world where kindness could break through the hardest of hearts. A world where, just maybe, even someone like Dominic Romano could find redemption. "I still can't believe it," Ella murmured to herself as she sat at the edge of the bed, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the blanket. She had never expected this, never thought for a second that her world would shift in such a way. Dominic's words, his actions, they kept replaying in her mind. "Maybe we can figure this out together." Together. It was a word that hadn't seemed possible before. Dominic, the man who had controlled everything, the man who had kept his distance from everyone, had just admitted that they could figure something out together. It was strange, disorienting, but at the same time, there was a part of her that felt a sense of relief. For so long, Ella had kept her distance from everything, hiding in plain sight, doing her job, and never expecting anything more. She had never allowed herself to dream of anything beyond the walls of the mansion she worked in. But now, with Dominic standing beside her, there was a glimmer of something more. Something that scared her, but also pulled her in. She had seen so much of him, the power, the coldness, the ruthlessness. But now, she was seeing a side of him that she never thought she would. The man behind the Mafia boss. The man who was willing to open up, even if only a little. She didn't know what that meant for her, for them, but she couldn't deny that it felt different. The fear she had once felt around him was fading, replaced by something else, curiosity, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. She couldn't be sure yet, but it was there, lingering in the space between them. It had been a few days since that moment in the basement, and things had changed, even if only in small ways. Ella noticed it in the way Dominic spoke to her, the way he looked at her, as if he was seeing her for the first time. He no longer ignored her presence, no longer treated her like she was just part of the background. It was subtle, but it was there, and Ella couldn't help but wonder what it meant. "You don't have to worry," Dominic's voice broke through her thoughts. He was standing in the doorway, looking at her with that familiar intensity, but this time, there was something softer in his gaze. "I'll make sure you're safe." Ella looked up at him, meeting his eyes. For the first time, she saw the weight of responsibility in his eyes. It was as if he was trying to protect her, to shield her from the dangers that surrounded them both. "You don't have to do that," she said quietly, her voice steady. "I'm fine." Dominic stepped closer, his footsteps heavy against the floor, and for a moment, Ella thought he might say something else, something to change the tension in the room. But instead, he just stood there, watching her. His presence was commanding, yet somehow comforting. "I know," he said softly, "but it's not just about what you can handle. It's about what I can handle." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Ella didn't know how to respond. She had never expected Dominic to say something like that, something that spoke of more than just control, more than just power. It was a glimpse into something deeper, something more personal. She looked at him, her mind racing, and for the first time, she realized that she was no longer just a maid in his eyes. She was something else. Someone else. "I don't want you to feel like you have to protect me," Ella said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can take care of myself." Dominic didn't speak immediately. Instead, he took another step closer, his presence filling the space between them. There was a softness to him now, a gentleness that had never been there before. He seemed torn, like he wasn't sure what to say or do. "I know you can," he finally said. "But that doesn't mean I won't try." The words were simple, but they meant more than anything Ella had ever heard. They weren't about control or power. They were about something else entirely. Care, maybe even affection, though he didn't say it. It was a feeling she hadn't expected from him, from someone like him. And yet, here they were, alone, in a room that felt both suffocating and comforting all at once. Ella wasn't sure where to go from here. She didn't know what the future held or what Dominic truly meant. But in that moment, she realized something. They weren't just playing roles anymore. They weren't just the Mafia boss and his maid. They were two people standing on the edge of something new, something neither of them had expected. The weight of everything that had happened between them, everything that had brought them to this point, was too much to ignore. But for the first time in a long while, Ella didn't feel trapped. She felt like she had a choice. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said softly, her voice steady as she met his gaze. Dominic's eyes softened, and for a moment, Ella saw the man beneath the surface. He didn't say anything in response, but she saw the flicker of understanding in his eyes. It was a silent agreement, one that didn't need words. The world they had built, the empire he had created, it was still there. But it no longer felt like it was the only thing that mattered. There was something else now. Something that neither of them could have predicted, but something that was beginning to take shape between them. Ella didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. This moment, this connection, was the start of something new. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of a future where neither of them had to play the roles they had been given. Maybe it was the beginning of something real. "I've been thinking." Dominic's voice was low, almost hesitant, as he stood at the window, looking out over the sprawling estate. Ella sat on the edge of the couch, her hands folded in her lap, her thoughts a whirlwind. It had been a few days since their conversation in the basement, since everything had changed. Since Dominic had revealed a side of himself she hadn't expected. "About what?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. She wasn't sure what to expect anymore, not from him, not from herself. Everything had shifted, and she was still trying to make sense of it. "About us," Dominic replied, turning his gaze to her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something she had never seen before. "About what we're doing here." Ella's heart skipped a beat. She had felt it too, the unspoken tension, the shift in their dynamic. But she didn't know how to address it. She had never been one to ask for things, never one to speak up about her feelings. She had spent so long keeping quiet, keeping her distance, that now, with Dominic looking at her like that, she didn't know what to say. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dominic took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them. "I'm not sure what we're doing, Ella," he said quietly. "But I don't want to pretend anymore. Not with you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ella felt her breath catch in her chest. She had never imagined that she would hear those words from him, never thought that Dominic would admit to something so raw, so vulnerable. He had always been the man in control, the one who made the rules, the one who held everything together with his iron grip. But here he was, standing in front of her, admitting that he didn't know what was happening, didn't know where things were going. And for the first time, he didn't seem like the Mafia boss. He seemed like a man, a real man, grappling with his own emotions, his own uncertainties. "I don't know what this is either," Ella admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know where we go from here." Dominic's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Ella saw the man behind the power, the facade. "We don't have to have it all figured out." he said, his voice gentle. Not right now, but I need you to know that whatever this is, I don't want to lose it. Ella's heart raced, her mind spinning. She had spent so much of her life hiding, staying in the background, never allowing herself to want more, to hope for more. But now, with Dominic standing in front of her, with his words hanging in the air, she couldn't ignore the feeling inside her. She couldn't ignore the pull between them, the connection that had grown over the past few days. She wasn't sure what this was either. She didn't know where it would lead. But for the first time, she didn't want to run from it. I don't want to lose it either, she whispered. Dominic stepped forward, his expression softening further. Then let's take it one step at a time, he said, his voice filled with a sincerity that Ella had never heard from him before. We don't have to rush. We don't have to have all the answers. Ella nodded slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She didn't want to let go of whatever this was. Not yet. I'm not going anywhere, she said quietly, meeting his eyes. For the first time in a long while, Dominic allowed himself to smile, a real smile, one that reached his eyes and softened his features. It was a smile that made Ella's heart flutter, that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a future for them. Dominic moved closer, standing just in front of her. Good, he said softly. Neither am I. Ella's breath caught in her throat as she looked up at him. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace, a sense that everything was going to be okay. They didn't have all the answers, they didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time, they were both willing to take the risk. Ella didn't know how long they stood there, just looking at each other, the silence between them comfortable, full of unspoken understanding. But eventually, Dominic broke the stillness, his voice low and steady. We'll figure this out, Ella, he said. The room felt thick, almost suffocating, but not in the usual way. This was different. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, something that neither of them had planned for. Dominic had changed. Ella had changed. And they both knew it, though neither of them had the words to explain exactly how. You've been quiet, Dominic finally said, breaking the silence that had hung between them for what felt like hours. He was sitting across from her, his usual commanding presence softened for once. His eyes were still intense, but there was something softer in them now, something more human. Ella looked up at him, her heart thudding in her chest. I'm just thinking, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know what to think, honestly. Her world had been turned upside down in the span of a few short days, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to accept everything that had happened between them. But she also couldn't deny that something had shifted. Something real. Dominic leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving her. About what? He asked, his voice still low, as if he was afraid of breaking the delicate moment they were sharing. About how much has changed, Ella said softly. How much I've changed. Dominic didn't respond right away. Instead, he sat back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. It was the first time she had seen him so still, so contemplative. I've been thinking about that too, he finally said, his voice steady but with a hint of something vulnerable beneath the surface. I never thought I'd be in this position, in this situation, with you. Ella felt her heart flutter at his words. She wasn't sure what he meant by this situation, but something in the way he said it made her chest tighten. What do you mean? She asked, almost afraid of the answer. Dominic sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. I never thought I'd care about anyone like this, he said quietly, his voice almost too soft to hear. I never thought I'd let myself care. The words hit Ella harder than she expected. She had always known Dominic to be ruthless, to be a man who never showed weakness, never allowed anyone to get too close. But here he was, admitting something she had never thought she'd hear from him. She wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't sure what to do. The man she had feared for so long, the one who had made his empire through fear and power, was now showing her a side of himself that was raw and real. It made her feel exposed, but also strangely safe. You've been running this empire for so long, Ella said slowly, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. And yet, you're still human. Dominic met her gaze, his eyes softening. I don't always feel like it, he admitted, his voice low. I've built walls around myself for so long. I don't know if I even know how to let them down anymore. Ella felt a strange sense of empathy for him. She understood that feeling, the one where you put up walls to protect yourself from everything and everyone. But she also knew how suffocating those walls could be, how they could trap you in a life that wasn't truly yours. You don't have to do it alone, she said quietly. You don't have to keep building those walls. Dominic stared at her for a moment, as if he was processing her words. Then, slowly he nodded. Maybe, he said softly. But it's not that simple. Ella didn't expect him to have all the answers, and she didn't expect everything to be perfect. But in that moment, she realized that for the first time, Dominic was open to something different. Something that wasn't about control or power, something that was just human. Nothing ever is, she replied with a small smile. But maybe that's okay. Dominic's lips curved into a faint smile, but it was enough to make Ella's heart skip a beat. I never thought I'd be here, he said quietly. But I'm glad I am. Ella's smile widened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something real. Not perfect, not easy, but real. She had spent so many years hiding behind the walls she had built for herself, living a life that wasn't really hers. And now, here she was, standing beside Dominic Romano, a man who had built his own empire out of fear and control, yet was slowly beginning to see that there was more to life than power. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was just a maid. She didn't feel like she was just a part of his world, a background character in his story. She felt like she mattered. And that feeling, that realization, was something she had never experienced before. Dominic stood up slowly, his expression serious but soft. Come with me, he said, his voice steady. There's something I want to show you. Ella hesitated for a moment, but then stood up as well. She wasn't sure where this was going, but she knew one thing. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of him, not of what they could become. Together, they walked out of the room, leaving behind the walls that had once defined them, ready to face whatever the future held, together. I was nervous, but not in the way I thought I would be, Ella admitted, glancing at Dominic as they stood in the hallway, the weight of the moment hanging between them. The air was thick with anticipation, though neither of them had spoken a word since leaving the room. Dominic had asked her to follow him without explanation, and now they were standing here, just outside the door to his personal study. It felt surreal, as if everything that had happened in the past few days had led them to this very moment. Dominic, the powerful Mafia boss who ruled everything with cold precision, was suddenly different, more vulnerable, more real. What are you thinking? Dominic asked, his voice low, but steady. He seemed to be giving her space, something she had never imagined him doing. She had always known him to be controlling, always the one who made decisions without hesitation. But now, in this quiet, uncertain moment, he was waiting for her to speak. I don't know, she whispered, still unsure of where this was all leading. She felt like a new chapter was unfolding, but she had no idea what the next page would say. I guess I'm just trying to figure out where we go from here. Dominic didn't speak at first, but he nodded slowly, as if he understood exactly what she meant. Then, without a word, he opened the door to his study and stepped inside, motioning for Ella to follow. The room was exactly as she had expected, elegant, rich, a reflection of Dominic's wealth and power. But there was something different about it now. It wasn't just the space he used for meetings and negotiations. It was the place where he allowed himself to be who he truly was, to let his guard down. Ella took a deep breath before stepping inside, her heart pounding as she crossed the threshold. She was used to this place being a symbol of dominance, a space where no one dared to enter without permission. But now, it felt almost intimate. Dominic motioned for her to sit across from him at the desk, his usual air of authority replaced by a strange sense of calm. I wanted to talk to you, he said quietly, his voice holding a sincerity that she hadn't expected. About everything. About what's been happening between us. Ella sat down, trying to steady her breathing. She had spent so many years being invisible in his world, watching from the sidelines as he ruled over everyone with an iron fist. But now, she was no longer a bystander. She was part of the story, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she was just in the background. I don't know how to explain it, Dominic continued, his gaze steady, his eyes reflecting something deeper. But I'm not the same man I was a week ago. You've changed something in me. Ella swallowed, trying to process his words. She had always known him to be cold, distant, but this was different. He was admitting something he had never allowed himself to acknowledge before. You don't have to say anything, Dominic said, almost as if reading her mind. But I just need you to know that whatever happens from here, I'm not going to pretend anymore. The sincerity in his voice made Ella's chest tighten. She wasn't sure how to respond, but she didn't have to. The words weren't necessary. The way he was looking at her, the way he was speaking to her, it was all enough. She felt a warmth spread through her, a feeling she had never expected to feel in this room, in this house. I don't want you to pretend either, Ella said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I just want to know that I'm not invisible anymore. Dominic's eyes softened, and for the first time, Ella saw the vulnerability beneath his strong exterior. You're not invisible, Ella, he said, his voice low, but filled with meaning. Not to me. The words settled over her like a weight, but a comforting one. She had spent so long feeling like she was just part of the furniture, just another face in the crowd. But now, in this moment, Dominic was telling her that she mattered. She wasn't just a maid in his house. She wasn't just another servant. She was someone he saw, someone he valued. I don't know what happens next, Dominic continued, his voice quieter now, but I want to figure it out with you. Together. Ella felt a surge of emotion that almost took her by surprise. It was everything she had never allowed herself to hope for, but now it was right in front of her. She didn't know where this would lead, but she knew one thing. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Dominic. Not of what the future held. I'm not afraid either, she said, her voice steady as she looked him in the eyes. Dominic smiled slightly, the expression softening his usually hard features. Good, he replied. Because I think this is just the beginning. Ella smiled back, the weight of everything that had happened finally beginning to settle in her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she could face it, whatever it was. With Dominic by her side, maybe she didn't need to be afraid anymore. Let's take it one step at a time, Ella said, her voice steady, full of quiet resolve. Together. Dominic's smile deepened, and for the first time, there was a lightness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Together, he repeated. And in that moment, Ella realized that this was no longer just about surviving in Dominic's world. It was about living in it. About finding a place for herself, not as a maid, not as an outsider, but as someone who was truly seen. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she belonged. I had never imagined that I would be standing here with him, Dominic Romano, in this strange, quiet moment where the world felt both still and alive at the same time. A week ago, I would have never thought this possible. I would have never dared to imagine that I could be more than just a maid, more than just another face in the background of his life. But here we were. The air between us felt thick with something unspoken, something more than just the usual tension that came with working under Dominic's roof. It felt like something had changed, not just between us, but within me. I had spent so many years hiding, playing my role, blending into the background, keeping my head down and my mouth shut. But now, for the first time, I wasn't afraid to stand here, not just in his presence, but as someone who mattered. Dominic's eyes met mine, his expression soft, almost thoughtful. You're quiet today, he said, his voice low and smooth, a slight edge of curiosity in it. I looked at him, trying to keep my thoughts in check. I'm just thinking, I replied, not really knowing how to explain what I was feeling. Thinking about what? He asked, taking a step closer. His presence was overwhelming, as always, but there was a subtle shift in the way he was looking at me now. He wasn't the cold, distant Mafia boss I had always seen. He wasn't the man who controlled everything with a flick of his finger. He was different, vulnerable even, about everything. I said, my voice quiet. About how much things have changed. How much I've changed. Dominic didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, watching me, as if weighing my words. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. You're not the only one who's changed, he said. His words made my heart skip a beat. I never thought I'd be in this position, he continued, his gaze not leaving mine. But I'm here, and I don't want to pretend anymore. Not with you. His admission left me speechless. I had always known Dominic to be a man of power, a man who never let anyone get too close. But now, here he was, telling me that he didn't want to pretend anymore. It was a raw, honest moment that left me breathless. What do you mean? I asked, my voice trembling slightly, unsure of what he was getting at. I mean, he said, taking a deep breath, I've spent so long hiding behind this image of who I'm supposed to be. the Mafia boss, the man in control. But with you, I don't want to hide anymore. I don't want to pretend that I'm someone I'm not. His words were simple, but they felt like a confession, a revelation that opened something inside me that I hadn't even known was there. I had spent so many years hiding, pretending to be invisible, afraid of stepping out of line, of making a mistake. And now, here he was, telling me that he didn't want to pretend either. It was like the walls between us were coming down, piece by piece. I never expected this, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. I never expected to be here. With you. Dominic smiled faintly, the corner of his mouth lifting ever so slightly. Neither did I, he admitted. But here we are. His smile was genuine, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. There was a softness there, a vulnerability, as if he was finally letting himself be seen for who he truly was. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't the only one who had been hiding. He had too. So what now? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Now, Dominic said, his voice steady, we figure it out. Together. His words echoed in the space between us, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was alone in this. We were no longer two people living separate lives, two people existing in the same space, but never truly connecting. We were something more now, something real. Together, I repeated, the word feeling foreign on my lips, but also somehow right. Dominic nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. We take it one step at a time, he said quietly. No more hiding. No more pretending. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. One step at a time, I said, my voice steady but filled with something deeper. We didn't have all the answers. We didn't know where this would lead, but in that moment, it didn't matter. We were taking this journey together, and that was all that mattered. Dominic stepped closer, closing the space between us, and for the first time, I didn't pull away. I didn't feel the need to protect myself or guard my heart. I was here, with him, and that was enough. You're not invisible, Dominic said, his voice barely a whisper, his hand reaching out to gently touch mine. Not to me. His words were a promise, and for the first time, I believed it. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't just a maid in his house. I was someone who mattered, someone who could make a difference. Thank you. I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Dominic smiled, his gaze softening. You don't need to thank me, he said quietly. You never did. I could feel the weight of everything that had passed between us, everything that had brought us to this moment. The walls, the fear, the distance, everything was falling away, and in its place was something new, something that neither of us could have anticipated. So what now? I asked again, my voice steadier now. Dominic's smile deepened, and for the first time, I saw the man behind the Mafia boss, the man who had been hidden beneath layers of power and control. Now, he said, his voice filled with quiet determination, we start a new chapter. Together. And in that moment, as I stood beside him, I knew that this was just the beginning. The beginning of something real, something neither of us had expected, but both of us were ready to embrace. I sat there, staring at Dominic, trying to make sense of everything that had happened in the last few days. A week ago, my life was simple, predictable, and quiet. I kept to my duties as a maid in his mansion, staying out of sight, moving through the halls unnoticed. But now, everything had changed. Dominic Romano, the Mafia boss I had feared and respected for years, had shown me a side of himself I never thought I would see. He had let his guard down, and in doing so, had brought me into his world in a way I couldn't quite comprehend. Are you okay? Dominic's voice cut through my thoughts, pulling me back to the present. I looked up at him, seeing the concern in his eyes. He had asked me that a few times now, and each time, I was left wondering if I was truly okay. I didn't know how to answer him. I was still processing everything, his words, his actions, the way he had changed before my eyes. But one thing was clear, the dynamic between us had shifted. I was no longer just a maid in his eyes. I wasn't invisible anymore. I'm fine, I finally said, my voice steady. It was a half-truth. I wasn't sure if I was fine, but I was trying to believe it. Dominic looked at me, his eyes searching mine as if he could see right through me. You don't have to pretend with me, Ella, he said softly. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made my heart race. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that everything between us had changed, that this new chapter we were about to begin was going to be different from everything that had come before. But I couldn't shake the doubt that lingered in the back of my mind. I had spent so long being invisible, staying in the background, that I didn't know how to let go of that part of myself. I didn't know how to step forward and embrace this new reality. Dominic seemed to sense my hesitation. He didn't press me for an answer, though. He just nodded and turned his attention to the room around us. The silence that followed was comfortable, but it was also filled with an unspoken understanding. We were both figuring this out, taking it one step at a time, like he had said. I could feel the weight of the decisions ahead of us, the choices we would have to make. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what might come next. Dominic had changed. I had changed. And somehow, that was enough to make me believe that we could move forward, together. The next few days passed in a blur of small moments, quiet conversations, and tentative steps toward a future neither of us had expected. We spent time together in ways I never thought we would, sharing meals, talking about things that had nothing to do with business or the power struggles that defined our worlds. It was in these moments, these brief glimpses of something real, that I started to see Dominic in a new light. He wasn't just the Mafia boss who ruled everything with an iron fist. He was a man, flawed, vulnerable, and capable of kindness. It was a side of him I had never seen, and one that made me wonder what more there was to him. As the days passed, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something different for both of us. Dominic continued to be the man who ran the estate, who made the decisions, who commanded respect. But he was also someone who made time for me, who listened when I spoke, who shared pieces of himself with me that I never thought I would see. "I've never done this before," Dominic admitted one night, his voice quiet as we sat on the terrace, watching the sunset. "Letting someone in like this. Letting someone see the real me." I looked at him, the weight of his words settling on me. "You're not alone, Dominic," I said softly. "You don't have to do this by yourself." He smiled, a rare and genuine smile that made something in my chest flutter. "Maybe I don't," he said, his gaze softening. "But I've spent so long keeping people at a distance, I didn't know what it was like to have someone close. Not like this." The admission hung in the air between us, and for a moment, everything else faded away. It was just the two of us, standing on the edge of something new. I realized then that I wasn't the only one who had been afraid. Dominic had built his empire on control, on never showing weakness, on never allowing anyone to get too close. But now, here he was, admitting that he had been lonely, that he had kept people at arm's length because he was afraid of what might happen if he let them in. "We're in this together," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Dominic met my gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment before he nodded. "Together," he repeated, his voice low and steady. There was a strength in his voice now, a certainty that hadn't been there before. I didn't know where this journey would take us, but for the first time, I felt like I was walking beside him, not behind him. I wasn't just a maid anymore. I was someone who mattered. And as I looked at Dominic, I realized that he wasn't just the Mafia boss. He was a man who had been hiding behind his own walls for far too long, and maybe, just maybe, those walls were starting to come down. We didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to find out. And as Dominic reached out to take my hand, I knew that we were both ready for whatever came next. I stood there, my hand in Dominic's, the weight of everything we had just said settling between us. It was no longer just about the estate, or the walls that had once kept us both confined. It was about us. The unspoken bond that had been growing ever since that first moment in the basement. I couldn't quite explain it, but I felt like we were on the verge of something life-changing. Something real. It was strange. The life I had known for so long, one of silence and isolation, seemed to be fading into the background. And in its place, a new world was opening up before me. Dominic, the Mafia boss, a man who had always been untouchable, was no longer just the cold figure of power I had feared. He was here, with me, standing in the same space, his presence now not one of command but of understanding, of shared vulnerability. And in that moment, I knew that something between us had shifted, that we were standing at the beginning of something neither of us could yet fully understand. "I've been thinking about all of this," Dominic said, his voice breaking the quiet between us. His gaze met mine, and for a moment, his eyes held something deeper than I had ever seen before. I've spent so long building this empire, creating a world where I controlled everything, but it's not the world I want anymore. Not if it means I have to keep pretending. I watched him closely, the words weighing heavily on me. This wasn't the man I had known. The man who always kept a distance, the man who ruled with fear, wasn't here anymore. Instead, it was someone who was finally allowing himself to be seen. Someone who, despite everything he had built, was ready to let go of the walls he had surrounded himself with. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice quiet, my heart racing as I waited for his answer. "I've spent so much time being the boss, being the leader. But I'm starting to realize that it's not everything. It's not what I want anymore," Dominic said, his words soft but full of meaning. "I've never let anyone get close, never allowed myself to care in the way I should. But you, Ella, you've made me see that I can't keep living like this." His words hung in the air, and I felt something in me shift. It wasn't just about his admission. It was about the fact that he was willing to let go of the control that had defined him for so long. It was about the vulnerability he was allowing himself to show, something that had been buried deep beneath the surface. "I never imagined you would say something like that," I said, almost to myself, still trying to process everything. "I never imagined I'd be the one to change you," Dominic replied, his voice low, almost thoughtful. His gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw a man who wasn't just a leader, but someone capable of love, of care. Someone who was ready to embrace what he had spent so many years running from. "It's not about changing," I said slowly, my voice steady. "It's about seeing the truth, seeing who we really are." Dominic's eyes met mine, and for a moment, the room seemed to shrink around us. It was just the two of us, standing there, acknowledging something we had both kept hidden for so long. "Maybe that's what I've been missing," he said, a hint of regret in his voice. "Maybe it's what we've both been missing." I nodded, my heart still racing as I stood there, unsure of where this new path would lead. But one thing was clear, it wasn't just about Dominic's empire, or my role in it. It was about us, figuring out what we could be together, without the walls that had kept us apart. "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice steady, though my mind was a whirlwind. Dominic smiled faintly, his eyes softening. "Now we take the next step," he said quietly. "Together." His words, simple as they were, held so much weight. Together. It wasn't just about him guiding me, or me following him. It was about us both choosing to move forward side by side, to share this new journey, whatever it would be. I smiled back at him, the uncertainty still there, but softened by the bond we had begun to build. "Together," I repeated. Dominic's smile widened, though there was something deep in his eyes that I couldn't quite read. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice full of resolve. "One step at a time." And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel afraid. Not of him, not of the future. I felt something else. A quiet confidence that maybe, just maybe, we were both ready to face whatever came next. "You don't have to do this alone," I said softly, stepping a little closer. Dominic's gaze softened, and he reached out, taking my hand in his. "Neither do you," he replied quietly. And in that moment, I realized that everything had changed. Not just between us, but within me. I was no longer the quiet maid in the background, invisible in his world. I was someone who mattered, someone who had a place beside him. And together, we would figure it out, whatever it was. I sat at the edge of the couch, my heart still racing, the world outside the mansion seeming distant and far away. Inside, everything felt still, but in a way, everything had changed. It was as if the air had shifted in the room, charged with something new, something that neither Dominic nor I could fully understand yet. But we were in this together, and somehow, that felt like enough. I looked across the room at him. Dominic, the man who had once been an untouchable figure, someone I feared but also admired. Now, as I sat here, close to him, I saw him differently. He wasn't just the Mafia boss anymore. He wasn't just the leader of an empire built on power and fear. He was Dominic, a man who had been hiding behind his own walls for too long. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just part of his world. I was in it. "You look lost in thought." Dominic's voice broke through my contemplation, gentle but full of concern. I blinked, realizing I had been staring at him without saying anything. "I was just thinking," I said quietly, my voice soft, unsure of how to explain the whirlwind of emotions inside me. "About everything that's happened. How much things have changed between us." Dominic's expression softened, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of something familiar in his eyes. Vulnerability. It's a lot to take in, he said, his voice steady. But I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you. His words hung in the air, filling the space between us with a quiet certainty. I nodded, my heart swelling slightly at his words. Neither am I replied, the truth of it settling inside me. It was strange, how in just a few days, everything had shifted. I had gone from being just a maid, a shadow in his world, to someone who mattered to him. And he mattered to me too, in ways I hadn't even fully understood until now. Dominic walked over to where I was sitting, and as he stopped in front of me, I looked up at him, seeing the man he had become. He wasn't the same person I had known when I first started working here. He had changed, just as I had. And that change, that openness, was something I never thought I'd see from him. We don't have to figure everything out right now, he said softly, his eyes meeting mine. But I don't want to keep living in this. I don't want to keep pretending anymore. I felt a lump form in my throat. For so long, he had kept everyone at arm's length, creating walls around himself that no one could breach. And now, he was telling me that those walls were coming down. For me. For us. I don't want to pretend either, I whispered, the words coming from a place deeper than I had expected. I just want to be here. With you. Dominic's face softened, and for the first time, I saw the full weight of what he was offering. This wasn't just about the mansion, or the power, or the empire he controlled. This was about him. And about me. And about what we could become together. He held out his hand, and without hesitation, I took it. The moment was simple, but it felt like everything was shifting, like the world was rearranging itself in front of us. I didn't know where this would go. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew that I was no longer afraid. We'll take it one step at a time, he said softly, his voice full of quiet resolve. Together. I nodded, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't fully express. Together, I echoed, the words settling between us like a promise. Whatever comes next, he added, his gaze steady. We face it as equals. No more walls. I squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of his words sink in. It wasn't just about surviving in his world anymore. It was about living in it. And for the first time, I felt like I had a place here, beside him. I wasn't just a maid. I wasn't just someone on the sidelines. I was someone who mattered. Dominic smiled, the expression genuine and warm, something I hadn't seen in a long time. I think we've both been waiting for this, he said, his voice quieter now. Waiting for the right moment to stop pretending. I smiled back, feeling something inside me shift. It wasn't just the connection between us, it was the understanding. The realization that we had both been living in our own prisons, locked away from the world and each other, too afraid to step out and face what was right in front of us. But now we were ready. I think so too, I said softly. I think this is it. The beginning of something new. Dominic didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at me with that same intensity, as if he were trying to see every part of me. And in that moment, I realized that I wasn't just looking at him anymore. I was seeing him. The man behind the mask, the one who had built everything, but had never let himself feel it. The man who was ready to take the next step. I'm glad you're here, he said quietly, his words simple, but they carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Me too, I whispered back. Me too. We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, no words needed. The future, whatever it held, was waiting for us. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel afraid of what it might bring. I sat in the quiet of the room, the weight of everything that had happened between Dominic and I settling in around us. It was hard to believe how much had changed, how quickly everything had shifted from what I thought was a life of routine, of quiet invisibility, to this new reality where I mattered, where Dominic mattered in ways I never expected. The days had passed in a blur, yet each moment felt more significant than the last. We were walking into something new, something neither of us had fully understood until now, but something that felt right. The future was unknown, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I wasn't afraid of Dominic, of what he represented. I had spent so long seeing him as a figure of power, of control, someone distant and untouchable, but now I saw him differently. He was still the man who commanded respect, the man who had built an empire, but he was also someone who had allowed himself to care, to feel, and that was more than I had ever expected. Do you ever wonder what the future holds? I asked, breaking the silence that had settled between us. Dominic was sitting across from me, his eyes thoughtful, distant as he stared out the window. It was late evening, and the light in the room had softened, casting shadows on his face. He looked more relaxed than I had seen him in a long time, and for some reason, that made me feel more at ease than I had before. Every day, he said quietly, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. But I'm learning to stop worrying about it. I'm learning to just let things happen. I looked at him, my heart swelling at his words. It wasn't like Dominic to be so open, so vulnerable. He had always been the one in control, the one who had to have everything planned out, every detail accounted for. But now, he was admitting that he didn't have all the answers, that he didn't need to. It was a revelation, one I hadn't expected to hear from someone like him. I think that's a good idea, I said softly. Not everything has to be planned out. He turned to me then, his eyes meeting mine with a steadiness that made me feel like I wasn't alone in this. Maybe you're right, he said, his voice low but sincere. Maybe we don't have to have everything figured out. But I know one thing. I don't want to keep living the way I have. I don't want to keep hiding behind this mask, behind this empire. I nodded slowly, understanding what he was saying. It had always been about control for him, about maintaining power, keeping distance between himself and others. But now, he was ready to let go of that, to embrace something different, something more human. So what do we do now? I asked, the question coming out before I could stop it. I had no idea what the next step was, but I knew that whatever it was, we would figure it out together. Dominic smiled, a rare, genuine smile that softened his features. We keep going. We keep moving forward, he said. Together. His words were simple, but they were everything. Together. That was all that mattered now. We didn't need to have it all figured out. We didn't need to know where this path would take us. But we were walking it together, side by side. I think that sounds good. I replied, my voice steady, a warmth spreading through my chest. For so long, I had been afraid to take chances, to let myself truly be seen. But now, standing here with Dominic, I felt like I could face whatever came next. We didn't need to have all the answers. We just needed to be in this together. And that thought, that certainty, made everything else fade away. The future didn't seem so daunting anymore. It felt like a promise, one that we would build together, one step at a time. I'm glad you're here, Dominic said, his voice soft but full of meaning. I looked up at him, my heart fluttering at the sincerity in his words. I'm glad I'm here too, I said, my voice quiet but sure. I'm glad we're doing this. The moment lingered between us, filled with a quiet understanding. There was no rush, no pressure. We were finally on the same page, and that was enough. We didn't need anything else. Let's take it slow, Dominic said after a moment, breaking the silence between us. We don't need to rush. We've got time. I smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. We had time, and that was something I hadn't realized I needed until now. Time to figure this out, to grow together, to learn what it meant to be more than just the roles we had been playing. To be real. One day at a time, I agreed. Dominic nodded, his expression softening even further. One day at a time, he repeated, his voice steady with conviction. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what came next, we would face it together. We were ready for whatever the future held, and we were no longer afraid to step forward into it. Together.